will be critically discussed and centrally relevant for many years to come. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Amy Reese Harper.
Thank you. Actually, that's a little premature. I actually have not received my doctorate yet, but hopefully in about 4 to 6 months, my committee tells me that I should earn that degree after I revise with them. So hopefully we'll be doctoring in a few months. I want to actually start off with song, because that's how I start my conferences and talks. And I'm going to sing, and I want you to kind of listen to the lyrics. And I want to let you know that the lyrics, it's kind of what embodies the work that I do and what's important to us Black female vegans of the Assisted Vegan Project. Okay? And I'm kind of loud, so I'm sorry if I go speak. We are the ones, we are the ones, we've been waiting. We are the ones, we are the ones, we've been waiting. We are the ones we've been waiting for. We are the ones, we are the ones we've been waiting. We are the ones, we are the ones we've been waiting. We are the ones we've been waiting for. We are the ones we will not bow down to racism. We will not bow down to injustice. Oh, we will not bow down to exploitation. I'm gonna stand. I'm gonna stand. So even though these are not my songs, but I've actually brought them from. The first one was work from Sweet Honey in the Rock, which is an African-American female a cappella group, and they intertwine social justice issues with music, and I think they're amazing. The second is the lead song to the soundtrack to Panther that came out in 1996, if you're interested. So why am I here today? Well, about 6 years ago, I decided to transition into veganism. And I had been diagnosed with a fibroid tumor, and I was in my early 20s. And I was panicking because the women in my family, my mother's side, had been diagnosed with fibroid tumors, and many of them had had hysterectomies. And I didn't really want to go that route. I also was at work, and the cubicle next to me, a woman had also reproductive health issues, a woman of African descent. And she handed me a book, and she said, "You have to read this book." And she handed me a copy of Queen Afua's Sacred Woman. And Sacred Woman is a book by a woman named Queen Afua, that's not her real name, but a name that she's given to herself, who's been doing kind of raw food vegan activism for the last 40 years in the African American community. And before I encountered this particular book, I had this conception of veganism as something that totally does not relate to my life. And it's because I had seen it through media representations of veganism being something that you do only for animal rights. The bodies that represented this constituency were largely white and middle class. And for me, the relationship to food and relationship to food in the body is something that's very much embedded in relationships of race, gender, sex in this country. And that's something that I never really saw in the mainstream vegan representations until this book came to me. And I opened the book up, and this woman, Queen Afua, began talking about how the collectivity of African American women's womb health was being negatively affected by the foods that we eat. And it wasn't just kind of keeping it at, this nutritional science level, but she put together this entire history since colonialism to the present of how the histories of antebellum slavery, the history of Jim Crow, of basically kind of being a black woman and living in either a slave society or kind of an apartheid type of America. And up until recently, even though we do have a black president, we do still have problems of racism. And how those particular types of never-ending traumas have manifested as ovarian cysts, as fibroid tumors in our wombs. And I found this, a little esoteric, but I also kind of connected to it in a way that I had never really thought of in looking at veganism. And she kind of proposed the idea of why veganism could be the most ethical choice for the African American community, and why for our particular community, why it is kind of a future of sustainability for health and the environment. So she educated me in a way that I had never seen in university. And she kind of brings in this philosophy that veganism is ethical for you, and this is why it's African American women. Before the collectivity of blacks in this country were enslaved, they supposedly had this southern Egyptian Kemetic diet that was plant-based and raw foods. And then being abducted and being forced to be slaves in the Americas kind of stripped that away. And then we're now eating foods that were supposedly not part of our heritage and ancestry. So for her to actually transition from this industrialized food diet to back to raw foods veganism is ethical, because you're now giving a people whose language and religion, spirituality, and food practices were taken away from them, we're getting it back into our lives by kind of taking this book and turning our, what she calls a corporate kitchen, into kind of this African, Kemetic, Southern Egyptian kitchen. And for me, I thought that was the most amazing thing I'd ever seen. So I'm coming from this concept of, okay, I have fibroid tumors, not necessarily because it's just random, but she's proposing that I'm eating in a way that was not part of my heritage, and it's kind of connected to what can be seen as legacies of colonialism and racism in this country. So that's kind of where I got interested in creating the Sister Vegan Project. And the Sister Vegan Project basically looks at, well, what does it mean to be racialized and sexualized in the United States as a black female? And then we've got, food and food studies, and a lot of the things I had read at that time, no one was really looking at race, whiteness, class. How does that actually affect not only your access to these particular types of foods, but how does that actually construct your consciousness and how you actually start thinking about what is ethical? How is it that I produce a sense of food ethics? Is it really universal? Is it really objective? And I'm a critical race feminist, so what does that mean? It means that I understand that the way American society has been organized, it's been organized around sex, race, class. And it's been this way since colonialism. So I want to understand, how does that affect people? How does that affect their identity? How does that affect policies? How does that affect everything? So as a critical race feminist, I'm looking at veganism and really trying to understand, why did Queen Afua really touch me in a way that it doesn't touch most of the vegan mainstream community that happens to be white and middle class in this country. So I did a call for papers, kind of looking for more voices about Black American female vegans in this country, because I knew I wasn't the only one. And I guess it was about a 5-year-long project to kind of put together these voices. And what I found were interesting themes. So first, most of the Black women that submitted something for this anthology were interested in veganism for the health reason, for kind of combating health disparities. Not many were as interested in doing veganism as something for animal rights first. So a lot of them kind of, what they felt was the proper way to go into veganism was very much parallel to the way Queen Afua approached veganism, which wasn't really surprising because most Black females in this country have the collective experience of both racism and sexism. And another theme that I also noticed was that though a lot of the Black women wanted to transition into veganism, socioeconomic class was a problem. A lower socioeconomic class or geographical restrictions didn't allow them to get the foods that they wanted. And if you look at the literature on who has the best access to the healthiest foods, it's white middle class America. So I kind of started seeing these themes that needed to be explored more. So the book came out in 2010, and instead of kind of doing a highly theoretical analysis of the work that I'm doing on my dissertation, I kind of wanted to read to you some of the excerpts from the book for you to get a sense of, what does it mean to kind of apply a critical race lens to this culture of veganism. And it's a big culture. So there are African American vegans in this United States. We're small, but even amongst ourselves, there's different sects. So let me just look at my thing. And this might, oops. So the first thing that I want to read to you is a poem from one of the contributors. I can actually access this. Technology. That's not the right side. Okay, one second. Okay. Okay, can't find the poem, but I'll read to you the second story I was going to read first. Okay. It's called Hospital-Sponsored Junk Food at a Healthy Bike Riding Event. One Sunday in October 2007, I went with a dear friend to an event billed as a bike ride along the Grand Concourse in the Bronx. And this is written by a woman named Robin Lee. To put this location in perspective, this aptly named Grand Thoroughfare cuts through the center of the borough. Before Mayor Giuliani came into office, Bronxites enjoyed the entire concourse, 6 to 8 miles closed off to traffic on 6 Sundays throughout the year for either walking or biking. This was immediately nixed by the Giuliani administration solely because he didn't like the Bronx borough president, who was Fernando Ferrer at the time. So much for the progressive power of politics, but I digress. That was during my pre-vegetarian getting fit for myself stage of life. So imagine my delight and anticipation after discovering the energy of fruits and vegetables and having learned how to ride a bike to participate in this great event. What a disappointment. It spanned only 3 blocks, not the entire concourse as in the previous years. There were various activities for kids and families, but many didn't show, and the planning was so poor that there was limited space to reclaim the roadway from cars. What was the point? But one good thing was that I found a group of riders who were on various committees to increase greenways in the Bronx, and they gave a great tour of areas I didn't know existed in a 20-mile trek around the South Bronx. Fear not, the days of Fort Apache have receded into the mist of the past as luxury apartments sprout up all over the place. This would have been a wonderful bike ride if more community members could have participated. The ride consisted mostly of people on those various committees and one unaware community member, me. I'm not the thinnest crayon in the box by any means, but I'll bike up inclines, or at the very least, give it the African woman 200% attempt until foiled by physics, vita momentum, and biology, fatigue, thighs, and legs. As I rode, I noticed how many young people are grossly overweight and how few places provide healthy snacks in many neighborhoods. As I was coached effectively by a generous fellow rider up one steep incline, a young girl remarked, "That hill is really steep. You can go another way." I went up and up, slowly, but reached the apex nonetheless. My fellow rider, Ed, was invaluable in a great company. I humbly sent a gashot his way. Now for my rant. A local hospital, Bronx, Lebanon, was one of the co-sponsors of this event, and they set out a table with information about hypertension, diabetes, and asthma in sort of a Wheel of Fortune setup. Participants got free treats when they either inquired about the information at the table, played the game, or just approached the table. The treats pissed me off. Oreo cookies, Chips Ahoy, and Nips, all in snack-sized packages that seem to predate the anti-trans fat trend currently running across the nation. Hackles raised. I went over to the table and declined the free treat offered. I asked if there was a nurse or dietitian at the table I could talk to. The table was run by non-professional volunteers. I was aghast. I asked if any of them lived in the neighborhood. The answer was no, but they were aware of the rampant diabetes and asthma in this community. I even asked if any of them ate those treats they were giving out. Two were 20-somethings who admitted they never, ever ate these snacks, nor much fast food. I noticed them munching on apples they brought with them. One other woman was the mother of one of the 20-somethings, and she confided that she never had these snacks in her home when her children were growing up. The Latina at the table was munching on some Oreo cookies and drinking café con leche. Then I went off. How dare they hand out these items, which clearly are counterproductive to the very information they are trying to convey? And so came the lame excuses. One, these are the excuses they gave her. The treats allure the community to the table to get them information. My response? You have a community, for the most part, has cultural ties to countries that have many lush fruits and vegetables that could have been incorporated into a healthier diet. Just a bit of research about papaya, mango, and root plants could have gone a long way. Ad agencies have sold us on the idea that free or low cost will lure people, but the biggest draw is acknowledging you see people by showing them their familiar culture. Two, these are mostly for kids. This is like a pre-Halloween event, and that's what they told her. Her response? Kids need the most help in eating healthy. Like reading, writing, and arithmetic, this information stays with them their whole lives. The real horror of Halloween is the sugar pumped into kids. Three, well, they can burn off the sweets while playing at various activities. My response? And then crash hard or have an asthma attack if they're susceptible? These things can't sustain energy. I wouldn't have made the 20-mile tour on my bike if I had eaten these treats. At this point, one of the thin 20-somethings looked at my 5'10", 210-pound frame and was amazed at my feet. I brushed that off, explaining that at 240 pounds, I completed a 33-mile Toy Bronx a year previously. He inquired how I'd done it. I told him by eating vegetarian, getting on my bike, and walking more. I'm not even focused on losing weight anymore. The process recedes into the background of my life as other things take my attention. I ended with the notion that while I applauded their efforts to provide healthy information and activities, this sort of thing was one step forward, two steps back, that served no one and fostered stereotypical notions of what true health is and isn't. Isn't it a shame that agency at the center of this mess is, of all places, a hospital? Then the truth. As the other ladies and attendants moved away from the table in the discussion, he confided that the treats were free for the hospital, left over from other events, and that they had no budget to set this up. I looked at him, pointed to his face, and asked him to examine the brown and black faces of the community he was serving. Then I stated, you probably think racism isn't as bad as it was before you were born. Think again. I wonder if he gave it any thought. And when I read Robin's story, a lot of things kind of developed for me in my head. So I'm not sure how many people understand the history of America and how most brown and black people view the medical care system. Many of us view it in a way that's negative because of the history of experimentation on black people. So when I was reading this, and she becoming upset that they're giving this obviously bad food to a community that already has health disparities, it kind of ties into this distrust that black and brown people have of what the healthcare industry really can offer them. How much do you care about us? And her kind of seeing them using this leftover candy to kind of hand out to a black and brown community that's susceptible, it says a lot. It says a lot in terms of how they're perceived as human beings, how important they are on the hierarchy of human beings in this country. As black and brown people, we are at the bottom. We're at the bottom in comparison to a white middle-class demographic. If you look at any of the literature out there that kind of talks about how racism kind of enmeshes itself with the healthcare system and how brown and black people are treated, you'll get a sense that even in a post-Obama era, we are not treated as well as white middle-class constituency. And when I read that, I kind of went back to Queen Afua's work and a lot of the work that she does. And she's a woman who wrote the book that I got into veganism about. She does not trust the medical care industry. She does not trust any of the food industries because of this overall history and to the present, kind of targeting black and brown communities. And if you look at a lot of literature looking at environmental racism and nutritional racism, you'll see that junk food advertisements are directed more toward low-income black and brown communities than white middle-class America. And that's done for a reason, because it's very profitable to target these vulnerable communities. So when I was reading her essay, and when I was kind of thinking of Queen Afua's work, I was thinking of, well, this is basically an interesting reason why Queen Afua feels that African Americans should kind of abandon this industrialized food philosophy and kind of go back to this raw foods vegan diet. And for her, revolution and decolonizing the body kind of starts in the kitchen. And depending on what framework you take, I know a lot of people have problems with, women going back into the kitchen and providing for their families, and that's so sexist. And the way I analyze it through Queen Afua's work is that we live in a country, for the most part, where the government really hasn't done what it should do in terms of resolving the damages of colonialism and slavery, and even now institutional and structural forms of racism. And we're not really relying on the government to actually take initiative, to not enact these policies that are clearly creating these hierarchies in which black and brown people are at the bottom when they're looking at how food is distributed, who gets the best nutrition and healthcare. So instead, Queen Afua and other people in this African holistic health community who are pro-vegan or pro-vegetarian, we've decided that we're going to go into our own homes, our own kitchens, and that kitchen is going to be the site in which we decolonize our bodies, in which we kind of resist these structural and institutional forms of racism. So Queen Afua asks that, usually it's the woman, to go into the kitchen and make sure that you can feed your family particular types of foods that nourish the mind, body, and soul. And not just for nutritional reasons, but if you're having a hard day because you're dealing with the stresses of sexism, racism, classism, don't eat a Twinkie, eat a raw kale smoothie. And for me, I really enjoyed what she had to offer as a way to kind of look at how veganism can be used beyond the tool of just animal rights, but as a way for a particular community to kind of fight what they perceive as the ravages of racism on the body. And so when I was reading the story that I had just read to you, these are the things that kind of went through my mind when I was kind of making the links to what I saw that was thematic with a lot of what the women had contributed to this volume. And then the second part to this too is the woman who wrote this story, Rhonda Lee, how she kind of talks about her body and how it's received. So she's obviously a large woman. And if you're familiar with the mainstream vegan literature like Skinny Bitch, which basically promotes going vegan to save animals and to become a skinny bitch. If you read that book, it's kind of implied that the audience is white, middle class, and kind of has a relationship with food where you have easy access to get the whole foods vegan diet that you want. And of course, there's always this weird association, which I know is controversial, that thin equals healthy. And that doesn't everybody want to be thin. And there's bodies of work that look at the body and really understand, that's not objective. If you look throughout time, the cultural values around what's accepted as healthy have changed. They continue to change, and a lot of it is kind of intermeshed with this white middle class aesthetic and white middle class value system. So in my book, I'm listening to Robin's story and how this thin person is looking at her and thinking, well, how could you be healthy because you don't have a BMI of 19 or 20? How is it that you're able to bicycle? So in the end of my book, Insistent Vegan, I have a compilation of like 8 or 9 of us women on the Assisted Vegan listserv from back in 2006. We end up talking about the body. We end up talking about how, at least in the collective African American community, a curvy, larger woman, larger than skinny, a woman it's considered beautiful or considered healthy. And if someone tells me, the mainstream tells me, oh, you should become vegan because you lose weight, it kind of becomes a problem in particular cultures, such as African American communities, that look at actually thin, if you look thin, that you need to eat and that you don't have the money to eat or you're unhealthy. So I want to share a story. When I became vegan, I probably lost about 25 pounds. And I will not hear the end of it from my father. He continues to tell me I look horrible. And he says it out of love, not to make me feel bad, but he's used to a healthy woman having curves, and just repeatedly telling me, you need to eat, you need to gain a good 20, 30 pounds. And I've heard this for years, and I've just basically given up. And it's just, but where does that come from? He's coming from this understanding of what a healthy body looks like, which obviously is not skinny bitch. So when I'm talking about how to speak to particular communities about, if you're a vegan and you're in the vegan mainstream, and you feel that veganism is the most ethical and sustainable way to achieve food for the future, you have to start thinking about how your race, gender, and class experience construct how you communicate why you think veganism, or if not veganism, locavorism, or whatever, is the right thing for a person outside of your culture. And that's basically what my work does, and what the Assisted Vegan Project kind of tries to elaborate on. So I want to actually read to you some of what the women were talking about when we transitioned to veganism, and we were either too thin for our Black community or too fat for the mainstream white community, and what does that mean? Hopefully it will work this time when I find it. Okay, so this chapter is called Veganism and Misconceptions of Thinness as Normal and Healthy. And I preface it with something I've actually written, and then it goes into the dialogues. In the year 2006, I initiated a discussion about body image on the System Vegan Yahoo listserv. The System Vegans had an honest dialogue about how we felt about our bodies. As women of the African diaspora practicing veganism, we expressed our experiences with struggling to fit the normal model of how our bodies should look. Some of us spoke of being ridiculed for being too big to be a vegan. Others spoke of how we were ridiculed for not having enough curves or a booty like a real Black woman. Below is the first message I sent to the listserv. Quote, "Dear ladies, a few months ago, we had an interesting dialogue about body types and the challenges to debunking the myth that being vegan doesn't mean that everyone will be thin. Furthermore, thin does not equal healthy for everybody. Last night, I just finished reading a chapter out of the book, Recovering the Black Female Body. It's called, quote, On Being a Fat Black Girl in a Fat-Hating Culture, end quote. And it's by Margaret K. Bass. It was really good, and it got me thinking about the conversations we had. There is a quote from Margaret's essay in which she talks about how one is not allowed to be outwardly racist or sexist in American society because it's not politically correct in the USA anymore. However, people who are fat, and she uses this word because she doesn't feel that using another word is politically correct, are constantly receiving prejudiced remarks and comments that sound like it could be from the same mentality as racism and sexism. She quotes from Susan Bordeaux, who talks about how U.S. society views fat people. And this is a quote from Bordeaux. The obese embody resistance to cultural norms. The obese, particularly those who claim to be happy although overweight, are perceived as not playing by the rules at all. If the rest of us are struggling to be acceptable and normal, We cannot allow them to get away with it. They must be put in their place, be humiliated and defeated, end quote. And then Margaret continues to comment on Bordeaux. Begin quote. I am defeated. I am humiliated and put in my place. And as I write, I marvel at how closely related this language is to the language of racism. My racial self would never allow this, but my fat self concedes, gives up. I don't think any middle-class person, woman in this country can be fat and happy. Despite the worthy efforts of fat acceptance crusaders, I don't believe they've made a dent in this culture's prejudice against fat people. Oh, you can love your life, have a great job and great friends, a wonderful marriage or partnership, but fat and healthy and happy? Not likely. Ask Jenny Craig, the Diet Center, Weight Watchers, Overeaters Anonymous. Consider the hundreds of women who would rather expose themselves to the risks of dangerous drugs than to be fat. Middle-class America, black and white, won't let you be fat and happy, and I resent it. I resent the ways in which I feel compelled to capitulate to someone else's standard of health and beauty. There are actually studies that suggest one can be fat and healthy, end quote. Let me come back in. This was an amazing chapter to read. Margaret brought up a lot of much needed reflections to talk about. I'm very curious about how I often see veganism and vegetarianism advocacy centered on a great way to lose weight. It's actually always bothered me, and I wonder why it has been normalized that thinness is normal for everyone, and that being skinny is a good health reason for engaging in veganism. Honestly, how is healthy defined? Who defines it? We all know that there are many cultures outside of white middle-class America that do not perceive a thin body as healthy or beautiful. I'm very concerned about how veganism is advocated if it still is founded upon white, Eurocentric, and middle-class standards of morality, health, and beauty. I'm just thinking out loud here, as Margaret's article really touched me. I practice very hard not to be judgmental of body types. I too often have to check myself and make sure I'm not falling to the land of isms when I talk about the vegan lifestyle and my perceptions of health with everyone. I always tell people, quote, well, everyone's unique and Whole Foods veganism has worked for me, end quote. However, I have seen many vegan and vegetarian people become judgmental toward female vegans and vegetarians who are not thin. They can be harsh and prejudiced in a way that actually parallels racism. And this really bothers me. After all, there are plenty of thin vegan ladies who are extremely unhealthy. So I want to share with you kind of the dialogue amongst us, and just to kind of get a sense of what the internal thinking is of these women and how they're thinking about their bodies. So the first dialogue, the beginning of this dialogue, starts with a woman whose handle's name is Nappy Locks. Breeze. It's funny you would bring this subject up. I recently had a conversation about this subject that brought me to tears of frustration. I am a size 12 to 14. This petite sister butted into a conversation I was having with another sister about vegetarianism and veganism. She said, quote, being a vegetarian is not healthy because all you can eat is carbs and they make you gain weight, end quote. Of course, she said this while looking me up and down. Then she started giving me advice about how she eats cottage cheese, string cheese for snacks, chicken breasts, etc. Then she said in a condescending tone, quote, this is why I look the way I look. I weigh 122 pounds and I am in my 40s, end quote. Whoop-de-doo, good for you, I said to her. For my body type, your weight would be unrealistic and probably unhealthy. So instead of focusing on my weight, I am focusing on health. And veganism works for me, end quote. We went back and forth with a few indirect catty insults to each other. She was calling me fat in a roundabout way. I glorified the African in my hourglass figure. She tried to say that men don't like all of that. I said that brothers don't like flat asses and no curves. I hate the fact that I had to resort to petty insults, especially with another sister, in order to defend my size and my lifestyle. But it seems as if I run into this BS often, and quite frankly, I'm sick of it. If the subject comes up that I am vegan, I notice the first thing that some people do is look me up and down. I see the doubt in their eyes and the tone of their voices. If one more person says some comment like, I tried to be vegetarian but I gained weight, or I heard that this can make you gain weight, I'm going to scream. I know I shouldn't take it personally, but sometimes I feel as if they are directing those comments towards me. A family member once asked me why I'm not eating meat. I said, to be healthier. And he cut me off and said, you are far from the perfect picture of health. That hurt. It's hard not to take it personally when people are constantly undermining you, trying to make a mockery out of you based on some blanket perception of health. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe that smaller vegan sisters have to engage in these types of conversations. I'm just going to make this, I want to read the whole thing. And there's more quotes that I could read, but I want to share that a lot of us talk about on this particular thread that, yes, us thin vegan sisters kind of get interesting slack anyway. But what I was trying to illustrate is that, what is conceived as healthy, what is conceived as the right way to eat, what is conceived as a beautiful or perfect body, it's not objective. And I think a lot of this kind of it's dismissed when the mainstream talks about whether it's veganism or not. Let's look at a sustainable future for food. Let's look at how people eat, their body types, and try to put together some universal notion that everyone should adhere to. And if you read through this assistive vegan anthology, you'll kind of see that becomes problematic because health, it's not as hard scientifically proven as many people think, and nor is the proper way to eat. A lot of what is considered science is still very much influenced by the social norms of the day. So what my research does is I try to understand, yes, how race and gender and class experience kind of affect people's notions of veganism, but also how the mainstream communicates or markets their sense of what a sustainable future is for food and health. What I get in terms of responses to my work is quite interesting. I get a lot of people who write me, and I have to admit it's mostly white identified people who write me telling me, race and gender have nothing to do with this. Why are you even looking at this? What does it have to do with anything? You're playing the race card, or you're looking for race, and those comments to me are incredibly interesting. It actually gives me more empirical data for my work to kind of show that there's this disconnect between the mainstream and what they're producing, which to me is a race-neutral or post-racial way of looking at how people should eat, versus when you actually look at who's doing the food justice, whether it's veganism or not. If you look at low-income communities of color throughout America, they're telling a completely different story of what sustainability looks like. So for them, a post-racial approach to a future of food is not sustainable. You need to have a race-conscious approach. And that doesn't mean that you have to, quote-unquote, look for racism in everything. That's not what a race-conscious approach looks like. A race-conscious approach looks to understand life in a way that doesn't ignore what the last 400 or 500 years of colonialism and racism have done to this country and people's perceptions, where they live, how they're educated. So that's what a race-conscious approach means. So when you go into a community, if you're PETA, for example, and you go into a community and you want to talk about why one should go vegan, I'll give an example. I have a lot of problem with PETA, and I think most people do, even vegetarians and vegans, because of the way they market and strategize. They tend to assume that everybody has this white middle-class, first-world privileged relationship to food, and that's not how it works. So, for instance, about 6 years ago, PETA had the Animal Liberation Project. And for you who are unfamiliar with that, PETA positioned pictures of Native American people who were on the Trail of Tears. They had pictures of Jewish people in the Holocaust, and then they had black men who had been lynched and burned. Pictured next to pictures of non-human animals, chickens, pigs that were part of the industrialized agriculture food system. And then NAACP became incredibly frustrated with the use of those images of black men being lynched for PETA to kind of put their vegan agenda out there. And the co-founder of PETA, Ingrid Newkirk, said to NAACP in response is, we're all animals, so get over it. And I was thinking, well, that's a really stupid way to get a population who has this huge racialized trauma to kind of jump into the vegan camp. So her response was kind of indicative of someone who thinks we live in a post-racial America where you don't have to worry about race anymore, and if what I did bothers you, then you're just kind of looking for racism. And versus her having a more mindful approach and thinking, well, I'm a white middle-class woman, and the way the United States is organized maybe is actually, something that I need to think about. Why is it when I say we're all animals, why is it animal does not bother me the way African Americans are bothered by it? Could it be because the way African Americans have been racialized, that they have been kind of animalized in a way that white middle-class women have not been animalized? Maybe I should think more mindful of why they have this respect. So what I'm offering here to the audience is that when we think about how to talk and how to do outreach about